everybody. Mark Schaftlein with you. This is the Schaftlein Report. It's Tuesday's edition, and we've got one of our favorite guests coming back to the show today with a new title, I might add. Dave Brat, welcome back to Schaftlein Report. Happy to have you with me today.
Hey, great to be on, Mark. Love the new studio. Looks great.
Hey, thanks, Dave. So, talking about new, let me make sure I got this title right. Vice Provost, Engagement and Public Relations, Liberty University. You used to be head dean of the business school. Tell me about the new position then before we get started.
Yeah, well, the pressure's on. I got to be engaging now. And so as the dean, I did a lot of that anyway. You know, we had the 500 CEO summit, and we put together a bunch of events like that. So they just want me doing that for the whole university now. So I enjoy getting out and about and meeting people in I was down in Florida for three of the major cities, and Atlanta, and up in Detroit where I was born. The Bloomfield Republican women had me up there. And so it's been a fun job.
Wow. Congratulations, Dave. You're one of the higher ups now, one of the grand poobahs.
So it's scary. That's right.
It is. It is. All right, listen, we got some scary stuff going on out there. And you know what, Dave?
Yeah.
The administration just glosses it over like there's no problem. The Federal Reserve is getting nothing but accolades from every business financial network, from CNBC, Bloomberg, Fox, etc. Dave, there's some real issues out there. I mean, we are 33 trillion in debt, approaching 34. Talk a little bit about some of the research that you've been putting together here on the gross domestic product, how much of it's related to government borrowing, deficit spending, because folks, Dave knows his stuff on the economics, and you may be hearing the stories out there, but listen to what Dave's telling you, because boy, if you don't pay attention to this, you're going to be a poorer person. Go for it, Dave.
Yeah, no, that's right. The basic numbers, right? You won't hear the big basic numbers ever come out. All the commentary is usually just about the stock market and whether how the wealthy are going to be doing. It's never about the real economy. And so I put together a few charts, but the basic numbers are what you just said, right? The debt's at like 34 trillion. It's going to be 50 trillion. According to CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, it's going to be 50 trillion at the end of this 10-year budget cycle. And then if you have 5% interest rates, which we're at right now, 5% of 50 trillion is $2.5 trillion per year in interest payments on the debt. And right now we're cracking 1 trillion on just interest payments, right? Throwing the money in the trash can. And of course, we're financing that from our kids. And so for the folks who know economics and budgets and stuff, I'll get into some of the stuff. But what's really going on here, right? We're growing supposedly, 4 or 5%. And, you just scratch your head and go, there's just no way that can be, right? The technological growth is not up. Capital formation's not up. Human capital, the school system's a disaster. There's no way. And so what's really going on right now, right? The Fed was printing money like crazy for 10 years in a row. And, with a 0% interest rate that put us on a sugar high and gave us inflation. Now the Fed is tightening, and we'll see if that's coming to an end. But now in order to make up for the lack of stimulus, now the federal government is doing $2 trillion deficits per year for the next 10 years. That's why you get another 20 trillion in debt. And so what's really going on with Keynesian economics, right? You all had your Keynesian cross back in Macro 101. The economy is made up of C plus I plus G plus net exports, right? Consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. And so what's really going on is the federal government now is going out and saying, hey, I'm going to take a loan out from our rich uncle. I got $2 trillion over here in my right hand, right? I'm grabbing $2 trillion of debt that we're going to owe to our kids, and I'm going to shove that over into this government account called government spending and call that economic growth. I mean, anyone in business is just ready to snap right there, just with that much of the story. It's just an accounting scheme, right? You're taking money in debt and putting it over here and calling that economic growth. Everybody knows that's not true. So a day of reckoning's coming. The street knows that. All the financial columns know that. But no one knows when it's going to hit. And that's the question. But I put together a few charts, and I don't know if you can pull them up, but a clever guy out at Seeking Alpha did what I've always wanted to do. I've never seen anyone do it yet. And the fact that no economists are covering these things ought to make you scratch your head too. I'm just covering the basic macro issues, right? So this guy just stripped out what I was just talking about. He just took away the fiscal stimulus piece of government spending. So government spending this year is $7 trillion, but the deficit is $2 trillion. So he just stripped out the $2 trillion and said, what would economic growth be without the $2 trillion? And instead of growing at 2 or 3%, you're growing at -8%.
Yeah, let's see if you can get that chart up, Mark. Yeah,
you might scratch your head on that and go, "No way, Dave, you're getting that." But just look at the common sense of it. $2 trillion is, approximately 1/10 of the economy. You strip out the fiscal expansionary piece of government spending, the deficit spending, you're way down at the bottom of that chart. And I'm being very generous here because this was 10 years ago when we only had $1 trillion deficits when this guy put this chart together. So it's likely worse than that. But I just want the people at home to get a sense to see that. So now there's your baseline. We got major debt problems. There's no easy way out of this. And that's the main take, other than cutting spending. We right now have a COVID budget with no COVID. And so we need to cut about $2 trillion and get back to when I was in Congress, the government budget was $4.5 trillion. So we need to get back to 4.5 or 5 instead of the 7. Yeah, Mark, I heard you coming in.
No, I mean, you're exactly right. And Dave, here's the question I have before we get to the next chart. The Biden administration touts Bidenomics, how great it is. Dave, it may be great for the top 10%, but for the other 90% of Americans that are not participating in this, cost of everything has gone up, and they're feeling it in their paychecks. They're feeling it in their grocery bills, buying used car, what almost anything. Is the Biden administration deliberately trying to mask this problem, as are the Democrats in Congress who refuse any spending cuts whatsoever?
Yeah, no, it's stunning. I just did a little recent analysis of back when Trump won the election and all of Krugman's comments, and the New York Times and the Washington Post and their coverage of the economics. And, at 16, 17, 18, before COVID, the business sector had very positive expectations, outlook, feeling, confidence, all way up. And right now, all of the major news pieces are hinting to Biden, hey, the American people are very upset right now, and they're upset with inflation, what you just said. They know intuitively they are way worse off. And people that don't track this kind of stuff, it's just, if you just say, for example, you had inflation of 10% and then 10% and then 10%. The news makes it sound, or say 10, 7, 5, right? Because it's going down. So you say, well, inflation's only 5% right now. Yeah, but what you missed is that prices went up by 10% and then up by 7 and then up by 5. So they're not only up 5, they're up 10 plus 7 plus 5. So your bacon's up 22% if you had 3 years like that, right? So we haven't had quite that much. But the main point is those price levels are still 22% up. You've never had deflation where prices came down. You still have positive inflation with prices going up over and above what they already went up last year and the year before that. And so that's real pain. And then, like you said, the wealthy own, the top 10% own 90% of stocks, bonds, retirement, pensions, and all that. So they did well when the Fed orchestrated 0% financing for them, for the wealthy for 10 years in a row. That's a good gig. And of course, the retirement folks and the middle class got nothing. And so, yeah, you're spot on.
Yeah. And again, Dave, I don't think this situation's getting any better. I mean, as your chart that we now have chart number 3 up, Dave, expenditures and the gap between where GDP is. Why don't you walk our viewers through that? Because this is a startling chart. And to me, unless some major changes are done, there's some real issues here.
Good. Yeah, that's right, Mark. And so the second chart, the basic issue is we need to cut spending. And then the conservative side will say, well, you can grow your way out of it. The left will say you can tax your way out of it. Both of those are false. I'll show you those very briefly. This chart shows a decade ago when we only had trillion-dollar deficits that it would have taken 7.5% GDP growth rates to grow your way out of 1 trillion deficits. So to grow your way out of $2 trillion deficits, you need 15% GDP growth. And in another chart, or you can just go look it up, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, only has us growing at 1.5% for the next 2 decades based on their modeling of our capital stock and of our productivity growth and of our education. So the best experts say we're going to grow at 1.5%, and my right-winger friends and tax cut friends and free market friends say we're going to grow our way out of it. No, you're not. And I wish we were, but you're not. The facts state otherwise. And then finally, the third chart, if you got that one sitting right there, the left says, well, we'll just tax our way out of this. Well, if you put all of these tax increases together on the wealthy that the left likes, right? You can the next one after that, it's just a bunch of text. It should say chart number 4, but I can just talk us through that one. Yeah. And basically, the logic there is just if you do massive tax increases on the wealthy, alternative minimum taxes, raise the corporate rate 10, due to all of those taxes over a 10-year window, which is equivalent to just balancing the budget 2 years in a row, right? So we're going to be 50 trillion in debt. All those tax increases only save you 4 out of the 50. So it's not a solution either. And so the politicians, of course, get penalized if they ever say anything truthful, which we have for the sake of our kids and our economy. We need to cut government spending because not only is it going to increase the size of our interest payments, but all that money's coming away from the private sector and it's going to take away from economic growth. And everybody in business feels it coming already. So serious times ahead, buckle up. And it could be a lost decade if no one in D.C. is willing to do what needs to get done here.
Dave, we're going to take a 60-second commercial break, but when we come back from this, I really want to dive into these figures and talk about what Congress can and can't do, because unless this problem is chipped away at, we're headed for some serious problems.
The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD, 720-605-3900. Supposed to be the safest placeholders for cash in the world, but in 2022 that changed. The Federal Reserve pulled out $2.5 trillion of liquidity out of the banks, and the Fed also changed the requirements so banks don't need to keep any funds on hand. This means banks are starved for liquidity and have now become very dangerous places to hold your assets. Get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD at 720-605-3900.
We're back with Dave Brat. Dave, we didn't talk about this, but I got to bring it up. Okay, Congress is now, as you mentioned, spending $7 trillion. And it used to be 5. Now, you and I both know there's no way they're going to cut $2 trillion out of spending. I mean, we just had the budget negotiations take place that cost Kevin McCarthy his speakership. And we won't get into the politics of that. But if they couldn't even cut anything out of a COVID-inflated budget, and with Republicans in the House, there's not going to be any tax increases coming about. Dave, we didn't touch base about the 3-headed monster, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, are there things that could be done with that without, quote, stripping the program, because that could actually help us with the deficit, because the expenditures for those programs alone are dwarfing the federal budget deficit?
Yeah, well, there's plenty you can do rationally, theoretically, but the Wall Street leadership crew better start talking together on that, right? The right wingers and the left wingers on Wall Street and Silicon Valley, right? Our top 5 tech firms, their market cap is worth more than all European firms combined, just 5 of those firms. So if those guys get together and say, hey, for the first time in my life, I'm going to think of another human being, little humor there, other than myself, that's what it would take, right? So is that going to happen? I'm highly doubtful, but that's what it would take. Those guys and the Wall Street guys would have to get together and say, hey, for all of our sakes, let's get a structure in this economy set, a baseline where we can do something for the next 20 or 30 years without this living over our heads. And of course, they won't do that. The one hope I will say is the Republican House. I was in there, right? 14 to 18. And the Republicans are never unified. And people wonder why that is. There is a reason. When the 220 get together in the conference, the leadership always said, you're off on your own to run for re-election. We're not going to provide a unified message. And that's a disaster for macro, economic planning. When New Yorkers got to say one thing and the Midwest can say something else, and you're all saying different stuff. Well, that's all neat to get reelected, but it's terrible if you're the adult in the room, right? We're the party of fiscal sensibilities and economic growth, or we used to be. And so that is the real thing. Now with Mike Johnson as speaker, there is a chance he could grab the megaphone and say, American people, we got a contract with America. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to run on. That's never happened. And it happened back under Newt Gingrich.
Right.
And he had success doing that. And Mike very well could pull that off.
Well, let's hope that happens, Dave, because these numbers, not just from your charts, but when you just look at the prism of the U.S. government spending and the revenues that it takes in, you hear people say it all the time. At a certain point, it's got to stop. Well, the problem with that is when that certain point comes, it's like in the stock market. You take the escalator up, but you take the elevator down. And you don't have time to respond when the crisis is upon you. And PhD economists, yourself included, people don't really, they've warned us, they've talked about it, but until that ticking time bomb actually goes off.
Right. Yeah.
That's where, literally, that's where it comes together. And you talk politically, Dave, you and I will disagree with the Democrats on virtually everything. But one thing I've noticed in this Congress, they vote as a block. They have no deviation, whether it's the most liberal squad members or, quote, moderate Democrats. Whatever Hakeem Jeffries tells them to vote, they vote. And there's none of this dissension that like our side has to deal with.
Right.
Your thoughts on that?
No, that's exactly right. And there's only one reason they get to do that, and that's because all the mainstream media, right, the New York Times I just referenced, they would run the Paul Krugman, newsreels, where he said every nasty thing about the Trump economy possible before there was a Trump economy. The night of the election, he said it's going to be a disaster. There's nothing good. It's going to be global, Armageddon. That the markets are going to fall apart. Economic growth is going to fall apart. And that's not even the bad stuff. The bad stuff is geopolitical. We're in for a disaster. Instead, we had peace and prosperity, no wars for 4 years, right? So those are the facts. And now the party of big government who wants to run your life is calling the small government people like me fascists. And I just find the whole thing laughable. But it's not laughable because half the kids are watching TikTok and they believe this, that small government people with a libertarian tendency that like Adam Smith and John Locke and James Madison, who wrote about the separation of powers out of Princeton, where I went, are the fascists. And you're just like, no, I'm the most boring guy there is. My thoughts haven't changed in 20 years because I got history and theory on my side. Why would I change? The left has gone nuts, and yet the voters are still voting. It's just the craziest society and cultural change. I never could imagine what's happened to this country in the last 5 to 10 years.
Well, the interesting thing about it, Dave Brat, is I think the American public is shifting to the Dave Brat's side of the equation, because a
I
lot of
hope
people
so.
are asking themselves this basic question. And the great Ronald Reagan, are you better off now than you were 4 years
Right,
ago?
right.
And
Good. Yep.
a lot of people, Dave, are thinking, wait a second. I used to be able to put gas in my car. I could go to the
Yep.
grocery store. My mortgage and rent payments were reasonable. The country was at peace. Let's see, who was the president when that was happening prior to COVID? Oh, that's right. It was that ogre, Donald Trump. Dave, I think, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm sensing it as I travel, as you do, across the country,
Yep.
talking to people. There's a lot of people that just, they can't stomach Trump, but when they look at Bidenomics versus how the economy was under Donald Trump, there's people that are saying, I'm voting my pocketbook. And I'll
Yep.
be damned to everything else, and I don't care what the media says. And that media influence, I think, is getting lesser and lesser. But Dave, with these options that you laid out here, I think there's a yearning to get back to the Trump economy.
Yeah, yeah, I do too. I'm always hopeful. The African American voters, the Latino voters, the blue collar, even the young folks now who can't buy a house are scratching their head and going, "Huh, this something's not right." But I will tell a cautionary tale of humor. In my old district, and if there's young kids listening, have them plug their ears. But basically, a porn star ran for the House of Delegates in Virginia, in my district, a bunch of suburban, highly educated people, and lost by 1,000 votes. And she was up all night. She was winning the race all night. And it was nationally, I'm sure most of your listeners saw that story. And so you're just going, oh, she ran on all the woke stuff, all the left stuff, in a very wealthy, highly educated suburban, without Trump on the ballot. And so something's still in the water that ain't right.
Yeah, there's no question about it. Dave, if you were king for the day, and
Yeah,
I looked at all your thoughts about ways we could do this, I'm going to give you a platform here. Okay, you're running
yeah,
Congress. There's no
yeah,
Democrats. Okay,
yeah,
whatever Dave Brat says that's going to be gospel, and the president has to sign it. Okay.
yeah,
All right, we're running $2 trillion deficits right now. They're not going to go away overnight. Okay. What
yeah,
combination of, we'll call it what it is, tax increases, cuts in spending, entitlement reform, could an independent Dave Brat recommend to our viewers and listeners? Things that are common sense, that when you
yeah.
strip the politics out, in other words, if you're running your family this way, these are things you would consider doing.
Yeah, well, the entitlement stuff, I'd make a fair deal. I'd put my grandparents and some young college kids on a stage together and get them to compromise over what's best for everybody. That'd be number one, because that's your 60% of the budget or 70%. And then I'd go back to the pre-COVID budget and hack all the rest. And that would be a $2 trillion hack. They just added on $2 trillion in deficit spending over the past 5 years. And there's no way we can live with that. There's no way. And
Right.
even the $5 trillion back then, it was too much, right? And then I'd get out my executive pen and I'd start slashing the education department in every which way I can and send everything back to the states. I'd put the FBI in Wisconsin or Iowa or Kansas. I'd put the CIA off in Texas, and I'd get back to the founders' logic. John Locke, prior to the founders, had this thing called self-propriety, right? The Scottish kind of twang to it. And that means a right to your self-property with no taxes. And that's the idea. The ideal is I want my own life back. And so the federal government is only supposed to be there to do the things that we cannot do for ourselves, right? Coin money, national defense, those kind of things. The rest of it, man, if you put the brains of the American people behind this stuff, it'd be outstanding what we could all do. And it's just common sense. But basically just the federal government, if you just look at any variable, as soon as the federal government got big, right, it was George Will just wrote a great book on this 4 years ago. The Conservative Sensibility, go read that book. But he starts it off, it's Woodrow Wilson, then goes through FDR, and then cemented with LBJ, the leftist project. But if you look back at FDR, basic family was intact. There weren't the social problems. African Americans were making great progress, like entering the private sector, jobs, wages going up, etc. Then we put all the welfare state stuff into place, and the social problems went up like a jet engine, and on and on and on. And then and the CIA, the FBI, the endless wars, this Ukraine thing has been a debacle. Now it turns out they got 60, 70-year-old Ukrainian men they can't field an army, and the war's still not over. And our Treasury Secretary is on the news last week saying, we got to win this war. Could you please tell me why? I mean, I love the Ukrainians. Right? They were attacked by Russia, but we poked the bear for 20 years in a row and said, let's make Ukraine part of NATO and the European Union and all this stuff. And Putin was very clear 20 years ago, no way is that going to happen. And we messed up. And we just, our defense industrial complex, we need to be zoomed in on China, and that's it. And all the rest of it needs to be cut so we can look at China, because that's what's coming our way. And so that's, if they were king, and then I'd fire myself immediately because I hate kings.
Dave, Brat, you've got some ideas out there that half of our audience is saying, yeah, this guy's right. The other half's going, what's he talking about? No, I mean, listen, some of this is common sense stuff. Look, there's going to have to be some entitlement reform. And you were in Congress. I'll give you the easiest prediction in the world. There's going to be a committee appointed, a study group. They're going to come up with cooking it a little bit. In other words, increase taxes, increase. They're probably going to say, all right, we're going to increase the amount of Social Security taxes up to X. Okay, and if you're earning more than Y, we're going to decrease benefits, and we're going to tweak the retirement age, and it's going to come in one package, and then Congress will have to vote on it. Everybody will come out and say, oh, I don't like this, and it'll probably pass damn near unanimously. Then that will
it has to, right? It has to.
Yeah, it does. We got 20 seconds left, Dave. I want to thank you again for putting together these slides in the presentation. Excellent economic stuff. Folks, if you want to get a hold of Dave Brat, he's at Liberty University, and now he's a big wheel, so you can reach out to him, call Dave Brat at Liberty, and he'd be happy to help you out with things. Dave, thank you for being my guest today.
You bet. All those charts and more are also at Brat Economics, B-R-A-T, Brat Economics on Getter. Tons of stuff for your kids to study. Just economics, no politics.
They do need to study it, especially over the holidays. Dave, thanks again. Look forward to having great, happy holidays, and I will talk to you soon.
Great show. Thanks, brother.
We are here to defend democracy for the people.
Banks are supposed to be the safest placeholders for cash in the world, but in 2022 that changed. The Federal Reserve pulled out $2.5 trillion of liquidity out of the banks, and the Fed also changed the requirements so banks don't need to keep any funds on hand. This means banks are starved for liquidity and have now become very dangerous places to hold your assets. Get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD at 720-605-3900. The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD, 720-605-3900.